Why is it that the people who seem the least desperate for approval are usually the ones who get the most of it? Why does the person who stops chasing suddenly become more interesting? The person who stops explaining themselves suddenly seem more trustworthy. The person who stops trying so hard to control every outcome suddenly find things falling into place almost effortlessly. You've probably noticed this without fully understanding it. The job you finally stopped obsessing over is the one that came through. The person you finally stopped trying to win over is the one who started showing real interest. And it turns out there's a reason for that, and it has almost nothing to do with luck. Most people spend their entire lives trying to control what others think of them, and the tighter they grip that control, the further it slips away. So let's talk about why this happens, and more importantly, how to let go of it. Because none of this is about becoming careless or indifferent. It's about releasing a habit that was never actually protecting you the way you thought it was. From very early on, most of us learn that approval is something to be managed. A child figures out quickly which behaviors earn praise and which ones earn disappointment, and from that point forward, a quiet project begins. The project of becoming whoever earns the most consistent approval from the people around you. You learn to read a room before you've even fully entered it. You learn which opinions are safe to voice and which ones might get you excluded. You learn that being liked isn't just pleasant, it's protective, a kind of insurance against rejection, conflict, and being left out. And for a while, this project works exactly as intended. Managing how you're perceived keeps you safe. It smooths over friction. It earns you a stable place among the people whose acceptance you depend on. But here's the hidden cost. The more your sense of security depends on managing how others see you, the less of your actual energy is available for simply living your life. Every decision starts passing through an invisible filter. Will this be judged? Will this be accepted? Will this make me look a certain way? And over time, you internalize a very dangerous idea. My worth is only as stable as the last opinion someone had of me. And that belief will quietly exhaust you for the rest of your life, because opinions shift constantly, and if your sense of okay depends on staying ahead of every possible judgment, you will never actually arrive anywhere safe. You'll just keep managing, forever, a performance that has no finish line, because there's always another person whose approval hasn't been secured yet. So instead of trusting yourself to simply exist as you are, you keep adjusting. You rehearse how you'll come across before you say anything. You replay conversations afterward, scanning for anything that might have landed wrong. You avoid pursuing certain things entirely, not because you don't want them, but because wanting them publicly and failing feels far more dangerous than never trying at all. And slowly your life starts to narrow around the avoidance of judgment instead of the pursuit of what you actually want. You protect your image instead of ever discovering what happens when you simply let it go, unguarded for a while. And that's the trap, because the harder you try to control how you're perceived, the more your effort becomes visible, and visible effort is exactly what reads as insecurity to other people, even when they can't name why. Confidence doesn't announce itself. It's recognizable specifically because it isn't performing for anyone's approval. And desperation, no matter how well disguised, tends to repel the very acceptance it's chasing. The longer you spend managing your image, the more exhausted and the less magnetic you actually become, because people can sense, even unconsciously, when someone needs their approval too badly to be fully at ease in their own presence. At some point, if you're honest, you notice that the moments you tried hardest to be liked were often the moments you were liked the least, while the moments you stopped caring entirely were often the moments things simply worked. You can't quite explain why, but you felt it. And that's when a quiet exhaustion sets in, not from failing, but from the sheer cost of managing a performance that never actually earns you the peace it promises. There's a reason letting go feels so counterintuitive. Somewhere along the way, most of us absorb the belief that control equals security, that if we just try hard enough, plan carefully enough, and worry intensely enough, we can prevent disapproval, failure, or rejection before it happens. But no amount of managing how you're perceived can actually eliminate uncertainty. People will judge you, regardless of how carefully you curate yourself, because their opinions were never fully within your control to begin with. What you're actually doing, every time you obsess over how you're perceived, is trying to solve an unsolvable problem. And the exhaustion you feel isn't a sign that you're not trying hard enough. It's a sign that the entire strategy was flawed from the start. Because real freedom here requires noticing where you're still trying to manage the unmanageable, not simply trying harder at it. Think about it. The relationships and opportunities that actually last are rarely the ones you white-knuckled into existence through relentless effort to be liked. They're the ones that showed up, or deepened, in the moments you stopped performing and simply let yourself be seen as you actually are. And if you keep interpreting every uncomfortable silence, every unanswered message, every hint of disapproval as something to fix immediately, you miss the exact information that would show you the truth, that most of what you're managing was never as fragile or as important as your anxiety made it feel. But you still want to be accepted, right? So what do? You lean on what you know. Vigilance. You try to prevent disapproval before it happens, instead of learning that you can survive it if it does, and this leads to something we could call preemptive self-editing, where you quietly adjust yourself in advance of judgments that, in most cases, were never actually coming. It works. Up to a point. You can seem consistently agreeable, safe, easy to be around. But underneath, you're depleted. Because instead of living, you're constantly forecasting how your living will be received. So now even simple decisions, what to say, what to pursue, who to become, get filtered through the question of how they'll look, rather than whether they're actually true to what you want. But you're capable, right? You should be able to think your way out of needing approval. So you try to reason with yourself. You remind yourself that other people's opinions don't matter. You tell yourself you're overthinking it. None of it fully works, because this isn't a logic problem. The need for approval isn't rooted in reasoning. It's rooted in an old, embodied belief that disapproval is dangerous, and no clever argument fully reaches a fear that was never installed through logic in the first place. There's no reassurance thorough enough to answer the real question underneath it all. Am I allowed to exist and be judged and be completely fine anyway? That question can only be answered by actually letting go of the management, not by convincing yourself in private that you should. And when the exhaustion of managing everyone's perception becomes too much, when the constant self-monitoring starts to feel unbearable, that's when a final defense kicks in. You tell yourself, I'm just thoughtful, I'm just careful, I just like to do things right. And now, instead of admitting how much energy you've spent trying to prevent judgment that was mostly imagined, you convince yourself that your vigilance is simply diligence. Not because it fully is, but because it hurts less than admitting how much control you've handed over to other people's opinions of you. So how do we fix this? The first step, and this is non-negotiable, is that you have to stop treating other people's opinions as something you're responsible for managing. Not because feedback never matters, but because trying to control how everyone perceives you at all times is a battle with no finish line, and fighting it endlessly keeps you perpetually unsettled. When your peace depends on universal approval, you will keep tightening your grip long after it's stopped protecting you, simply because letting go feels like standing somewhere exposed. So the fix is to practice releasing your grip in small, deliberate ways. You stop asking, how will this be perceived? And you start asking, is this actually true to what I want? You stop pre-editing yourself out of imagined disapproval and let your real thoughts, choices, and preferences exist before you manage them into something safer. You let yourself say the honest thing, pursue the real interest, take the risk that might not land, and discover that the world doesn't end. And yes, it's uncomfortable. It can feel reckless at first, like removing a safety mechanism you've relied on for years. But it's not a step backward, because it's the first real step toward a kind of stability that doesn't depend on anyone else's verdict. The old identity told you that security came from managing every impression perfectly. The new one reminds you that security was always meant to come from inside you, and you simply handed that responsibility to everyone else out of habit. Being human means you're allowed to be misunderstood occasionally and remain entirely fine. You're allowed to disappoint someone and stay at peace with the decision anyway. You're allowed to want things, pursue things, and fail at things publicly, without that failure defining what you're worth. But the only way forward is to practice this letting go in small, repeated moments, not in one dramatic act of rebellion against everyone's opinion at once. Not total indifference to others, just small, repeated proof that disapproval, when it comes, is survivable, and that most of what you feared was never actually watching as closely as you assumed. So if you're someone who feels the constant pull to manage how you're perceived, who rehearses conversations and replays interactions long after they're over, if you've spent your whole life trying to control an audience that was mostly imaginary, this is where you begin. You let go of the management. You stop performing for a verdict that was rarely being handed down in the first place. You start simply living instead. Because you don't need everyone's approval to be at peace in your own life. You just need to be someone who's willing to exist honestly, even when it's uncomfortable, even when someone disagrees, even when letting go feels like losing your grip on something important. And if you can do that, if you can stop chasing approval and start trusting yourself instead, you'll start to notice something strange happening. The things you were chasing start arriving on their own, not because you finally worked hard enough to earn them, but because you finally stopped needing them to arrive. If any part of this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these patterns, leave a comment and let me know what stood out. Chances are, you're not the only one who feels this way, and sometimes naming the pattern is the first real step to breaking it. Thanks for listening to episodes of Kynn. Take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next episode.